Good morning, good afternoon. Thank you everybody for joining us for today's Keeping Transit Moving webinar and public policy forum hosted by Canadian Urban Transit Association. I know we've got a lot of folks that have registered, so we're just going to hang on for about 30 seconds before we get underway, just to give people a moment to log in and join us. Okay, I think we're ready. So again, thank you. We're here for what I think will be a really interesting discussion about keeping transit running and how to keep it strong in a post-pandemic world. So we're at about 24 months now since the pandemic started. We know that it's impacted our industry dramatically, with people working from home, studying at home, staying home. We lost about half of our ridership. But have held on to that. Certainly it was much lower during the worst part of the pandemic. And some parts of the country are up in the 60 and 70% region, but in general across Canada, we're running about half of our pre-pandemic ridership. And so that's costing us about $2 billion in revenue every year. So in the early months of the pandemic, we know governments helped us delivering more than $4 billion in support, but those funds were running out, and cities couldn't fill those revenue gaps alone, and steep service cuts would likely be inevitable. But last week was a good week for public transit. First, Ontario said that it would provide more support, and then the federal government announced that it was willing to provide up to $750 million. Now, of course, there's conditions and provinces will have to match federal dollars, but it's clear that things look better this Wednesday than they did last Wednesday. So we have some reason to celebrate. And no better way to do that than talking public policy with our impressive panel that has joined us here for this hour, each of whom has prepared a statement about some questions that we'll be discussing. The broad question our panel seeks to answer today is, how can we keep transit running for those who depend on it while it remains strong in a post-pandemic world? And we are getting closer to that each week, and it is good to see. So let me, without further ado, present today's panel. So we've got joining us today, Dr. Yona Freemark. Excuse me. Dr. Freemark is a senior research associate in metropolitan housing and communities at the Urban Institute. His research focuses on the intersection of land use, affordable housing, and transportation. Also, Dr. Shoshana Sachs, an assistant professor at the University of Toronto's Department of Civil and Mineral Engineering and a Canada Research Chair in Sustainable Infrastructure. She investigates the relationship between infrastructure we build and the society we create to identify opportunities and pathways to better align infrastructure provision with sustainability. Also joining us, Dr. Jonathan English, Director of Policy for Transportation, Infrastructure and Trade at Toronto Region Board of Trade. He is a doctorate in urban planning from Columbia, with research examining suburban transit policy and the relationship between transit service levels from a demand and a historical perspective. Kelly Polechny is also on our panel. She's been with London Commission for 24 years and has held the role of GM since 2015. In addition to her role at LTC, Kelly's a member of the Executive Committee of CUTA and is the chair of the board at the Ontario Public Transit Association. And finally, we also have joining us Carrie Houghton McDonald, branch manager at Edmonton Transit Service, where she oversees the delivery of conventional bus, on-demand LRT and paratransit service. She's worked in the transit industry for over a decade and is passionate about transit's role in creating vibrant, healthy, and climate-resilient cities. She's also the first woman to be at the helm of ETS in its history. Okay, great panel, and thank you very much for spending the next hour with us. So why don't we dive right in here into our discussion questions. So the first one, Dr. Sachs, I want to talk to you about why, despite greater numbers of people working from home, why is it that investing in transit continues to be so important? You recently wrote a piece for TVO called "The Case Against Delaying Toronto Subway Plans." So could you tell us a bit about why that's important and why the pandemic shouldn't derail transit expansion projects, not only in Toronto, but across Canada?
Thank you. Writing that op-ed was great for me because it let me use my favorite line, which is, infrastructure is destiny. We get the future we build. And this is really important to remember now when we're talking about transit, as we think about what kind of future do we want, even though the present is pretty far from that, right? None of us would choose to live in a pandemic. We didn't choose to have a dramatic transformation of our working patterns. Sorry, can you hear me okay? Okay, perfectly. Great. Sorry. Wonderful. So we didn't choose this pattern. And so we keep hearing people say, well, is the future going to be dramatically different? Are we never going back to the office? Are we all going to be isolated at home forever? And one of the really important things to remember is, what do we mean when we mean the future? What timeline are we talking about? Lots of people talk about the future as it's a fixed thing. But the future 2 months away or 3 months away or 5 years away, 10 years away are all quite different. And we have to remember that transit is a long-term investment. It's the spinal system. It's the backbone of our cities, of our community, of our infrastructure network. And so we have to make decisions with that in mind. And if we believe that the future will be devoid of transit and therefore don't build any, it will be a self-fulfilling prophecy. If we think about, okay, what future do we want? We want a transit-oriented future. We want one where everybody can go where they need to get to. We want one with clean air and cheaper costs for everybody. Then we want one based on transit. Then we can make that choice and invest in it. The pandemic will not last forever, and we want to be prepared for the world after that. All of that being said, in very North American standard, we've had a moral panic about transit that is not at all placed in data. Okay, this idea is that transit is a very dangerous place to be. There's almost no evidence of that, and lots of evidence to the contrary. Transit can be made very, very safe. And we haven't, as a society or as North American transit community, done a good job at explaining that. So people still have this false belief that it's dangerous. So both because A, it's not dangerous and we shouldn't be avoiding it. And two, or B, because we get the future we build, we need to continue to invest in transit and remember that the future changes, and what exists 2 months from now will be very different 5 years from now or 10 years from now when new transit starts to come online.
Right, and so getting back to your point there, which I think was very, very good, which was building for the future that we deserve. Let's bring in the panel here. So we'll start with Dr. Freemark first, with respect to keeping transit open and post-pandemic world. Your thoughts on that?
You know, I think one of the things that we've been able to see most clearly during the pandemic is that a huge share of the people we rely on most in the society continue to use transit, even though ridership overall has declined. You know, I think it's really important to emphasize that the transit system has continued to play this essential role transporting people with low incomes, people who are working in places like grocery stores and hospitals, places that we all continue to need. And so even though a significant share of the workforce has started working from home, that essential worker group still needs an essential and quality level of transit service throughout their communities. And I think that's something that has become apparent, but needs to be reinforced in the choices we make about service planning over time. So my big conclusion from this pandemic period has been that we need to identify the populations, the people who are most likely to use transit, find ways to serve them better, more conveniently, more frequently, and then extend that out to the rest of the population as we come back from the pandemic.
Okay, let's continue moving down the line with looking at the post-pandemic world and your opening thoughts. Dr. English. Just unmute though.
Oh, having some muting, yeah. Think I would have learned. Thank you so much for having me here. And, you know, certainly this is a time when we really have to think about the future of transit. As we finally, we hope, move into our recovery, we need to have a transit system that is there for us, and, you know, for workers who will need it. It's simply not possible for all of us to move around by car. Many of us can't drive or can't afford to drive, and others simply can't fit on the highways. We can't expand our highway infrastructure, and they're already congested, and we've seen that throughout the pandemic, that our highways are congested. You know, one of the real real concerns we have is that as the revenue has, of course, plunged in the pandemic, budgets are under enormous pressure, and the worst case scenario is that we see radical cuts in service in our own region, Toronto region, in the early 1990s when we were hit hard by a recession. We cut service quite radically and also raised fares, and it took well over a decade for the ridership to recover. Conversely, in the early 80s, service was maintained, and despite an equally severe recession, the ridership really didn't go away over the long term. So, I think this is a really important lesson, and that's why the announcements we've seen recently about support to make sure that transit agencies can keep their service running are so important. We worked at the board on a report recently called Next Stop, where we tried to look into the future of what we would need to do to not only get people back on transit, but get more people on transit, which is what we needed before the pandemic and will continue to need. So one of the things we called for was a service standard of turn up and go service levels on all key transit routes, across the Toronto region. This is certainly something that is applicable elsewhere as well. Now more than ever, we recognize that off-peak travel, evening travel, weekend travel, that's when essential workers are making their trips in many, many cases. They need to be able to continue to make those trips, and we need to make it possible for people, for example, in the new schedules that we might be looking at, new work schedules with partial work from home, that people are able to travel not just at 9 in the morning and 5 in the evening, as has been the case in many places until now. So we called for this 10-minute service standard for key routes all day in this report. When we look at our transit routes across the Toronto region, and this isn't just a Toronto story, Vancouver as well, and Broadway, we have some of the busiest bus routes in the world. Before the pandemic, routes like Finch East, Lawrence East, these moved, in excess of 50,000 riders a day. This is an enormous number of people, and so again, we need to take a look at what we can do to make those routes operate more fluidly with infrastructure, et cetera. And we've been working on pilot projects as well. We've asked government in partnership with other chambers to look at pilot projects where we can introduce that frequent turn up and go service on key routes, so that we can really get people back on transit as we recover from the pandemic.
Thank you very much. We'll hear from some of our local transit providers and their perspectives. I'll start with Edmonton and Carrie Houghton McDonald.
Thanks so much, Marco, and thanks to CUTA for inviting me today. Really excited to be among these speakers. So, I've reflected a lot on this, and I think to keep transit running on our end, it's really about delivering and promoting great service. We have heard time and time again, people want convenient, reliable, safe, and fast transit service. And, secondly, I think we need to change how we measure our results, so we directly impact economic, health, climate, equity, and social outcomes. And I think we need to do a better job at measuring that and telling our story. We also need to focus on our role, as others have said, as an essential service in our communities. So as we move forward, it's even more critical that we've got to be listening, we've got to be learning and adapting to meet the needs of our diverse communities. Through our listening in Edmonton, we've learned that a one-size-fits-all approach to transit service, it just doesn't cut it. We're working really hard to change that. We've incorporated gender-based analysis to consider intersectional perspectives as we go through our work, and really try and collaborate and understand the needs of equity-seeking groups and make those changes together. So a really simple example, incorporating caregiver needs in the design of our on-demand transit service. Last spring, we introduced a full redesign of our bus network. It was designed with input from about 40,000 people. Since that time, we've made 60 additional tweaks and adjustments, listening to that feedback, and again, learning and adapting. We've created a high-frequency corridor for our buses, improved our crosstown and express routes, and we've added more weekend service. We've got frequencies of about 7.5 minutes during peak on some of our routes, and I'm really proud of that. I think it's a really important shift. We've also got the largest on-demand transit service plan in Canada. So we connected 37 neighborhoods and 16 seniors residences. And this helps with access, so connecting more people to our transit hubs. Some of them had no service prior to this launch. On the LRT side, we've moved to 5-minute peak frequencies. Again, I'm super proud of that change. I think it's a critical enabler for some of the outcomes that we talked about earlier. We're also allowing bikes on LRT, so we want to see better integration with active modes of transportation, again, to improve access for people. Another important change for us is smart fare payment technology and fare capping. So fare capping in particular is going to directly help those who are experiencing lower income levels and help those riders, and research shows it's been women who do this the most with trip chaining along their transit journey. So I'm really excited to see the impact of that shift. Throughout the pandemic, women, students, frontline workers, people who have lower income levels, healthcare workers, I've seen construction workers, seniors, parents, and caregivers have relied on us to get to where they need to go. And again, we're going to continue to do that to meet their transportation needs as we move forward. So I think by focusing on delivering great service, changing our approach to how we measure the impact and results that we get, and diving a bit deeper into our role as an essential service in the communities, I'm confident we're going to continue to enable mobility, and we're going to achieve great things with our communities as we move forward.
Hey, thank you. And now go over to Kelly Pleshnik from London Transit.
Thanks, Marco. I'm not going to repeat everything Carrie just said, but I think that's fairly consistent with pretty much all of the transit systems, the things that we're looking at trying to accomplish. And I mean, in terms of what we've learned through the pandemic, and I think all of the speakers have touched on it, we've certainly learned the critical role that transit has played in keeping our communities moving. And while maybe we in transit have not necessarily, that's not news to us, I think it was certainly reinforced at all levels of government, the critical role that transit plays. And I think doing all the things that Carrie just talked about, and continuing to improve our services and respond, being more a part of the active mobility discussions in our communities, improving quality service. We do, as transit systems, have to learn to pivot and adapt more quickly. And I think we all learned through the pandemic that what we historically thought was impossible to make, service level changes, in a month and a half, those things had to happen, and they did. So we all learned that we could, in fact, pivot more quickly than what we had historically done. And I think that's going to be imperative going forward as well. But I think that the critical piece, and Carrie touched on it, is we need to start talking about transit differently and measuring the impacts of our services on our communities differently. The discussion can no longer be just about ridership, because I think we can all agree it's going to take time for that ridership to come back. But in order for us to get that ridership back and hopefully continue to grow ridership in the future, what we have to avoid is any negative service reductions or anything in addition that's going to be negative to our plans moving forward. And in order to do that, I think we have to get all of our stakeholders to gain a better understanding of all of the positives that transit brings to our communities. And I think, and when I say all stakeholders, obviously investors, that would be our local politicians as well as provincial and federal. But I think just the community in general, and I think we've all got a role to play in that. But the more we can get people talking about and understanding the important role that transit plays, I think the better chance we'll have at continuing to secure the funding that we're going to need to continue to drive our way out of this and continue to grow going forward.
Okay, great. So picking up on that theme of maintaining services, we heard from our last two speakers, especially as the key to attracting riders back to transit and avoiding, what our association and our members and stakeholders warned against, and that was preventing a downward spiral. So in particular, there was an idea of induced demand. So at the Toronto Region Board of Trade, they recently released a report on rebuilding transit back stronger post-pandemic in the Toronto region. So maybe to Jonathan English, can you just take us through some of the recommendations that were in that report?
Yeah, so some of the key recommendations, we tried to touch on a couple different areas. So the first one was around turn up and go transit. So, we wanted to make it so that at least on key routes, a rider would know that when they get to the bus stop, that the bus will be along soon. And that's true even if they need to travel in the evening or midday or on the weekend. So we called for a 10-minute service standard on key routes. The second thing we did was also say that, look, that's not necessarily going to be possible everywhere. So there need to be steps taken, whether that's on demand or other types of approaches, especially now during the pandemic, to make sure that there's transit access in some of the areas where that would be more challenging, like deep in a suburban neighborhood, for example, where you're far from an arterial. One of the second calls, as I mentioned, before, we need to do a little bit. I'm not talking about mega infrastructure in this case, but again, we have some bus routes in Canada that move tens of thousands of riders a day, a lot of them, in fact. And in many cases, they don't have so much as a lane or a signal priority or things like that. There are a lot of small interventions, upgraded shelters, that can make it much more appealing for riders on routes where we're already seeing a lot of rider interest, and where ridership in many cases held up more strongly throughout the pandemic. And there are other things as well in terms of data sharing and new innovations. But I think the key message of the report is that transit needs to be accessible to everyone, and that's and that transit's all about going from A to B. So we can worry about A, yes, the transit needs to be frequent running past your house, but it also needs to be frequent at your workplace or your destination or your friend's house. So that's the need for that universality of transit, to really make it a viable option so people don't have to buy the second car. And so people who can't drive aren't trapped in their house or limited in terms of their employment or other opportunities.
We've got a moment here. Did anyone else on the panel want to jump in? Just feel free to unmute here. Sure.
I completely agree with everything that was just said. One thing that I would add to that is when we're talking about A to B, it matters also where A and B are. And those are choices, not necessarily that sit within transit authorities, but within their close colleagues over at land use planning, zoning, and things that sit within the control of government. Transit and land use are one system, and we plan them separately to our detriment, and we plan them together to our advantage. Toronto's transit used to be held up as a global example of success because in the 60s, we built around our transit stations. The old TTC code had even structural designs built into the stations so that you could put tall buildings beside stations really easily. We were that dedicated to transit-oriented land use that we built our station boxes to make it possible. In the 70s, almost all new residential development in Toronto was within 5 minutes walking of a station. Right? These are things that we've taken very seriously historically and not so seriously for the last 20, 40 years, but we could take seriously again. And it's been interesting to see the movements in Ontario, at least at the provincial level, to say cities have no choice, they have to allow development near transit. And it'll be interesting to see which cities are dedicated to that idea of making A and B oriented, both around the transit we already have, as well as connecting A and B with future transit.
Fantastic. Any others? Okay, thank you. Okay, so we'll go on to our next question. It goes back a bit to Carrie, what you were discussing in your opening statement with respect to a strong link between attracting riders back and the kind of service that equity-seeking groups need as well. So on that point, I believe one of the recommendations that you helped to work on in a recently released report, understanding and responding to the transit needs of women in Canada. Could you tell us a bit about the perspective that you made in that or contributed in that report in linking equitable service to ridership recovery?
Sure thing. Thanks for the question. I think that report in particular is a bit groundbreaking for Canadian transit properties. So there has been lots of research out of the US as an example and overseas saying, you know what, there are gender differences when it comes to transit needs and transit service. And this study in particular really engaged a cross section of us to participate and do a deeper dive and understanding, are there gender differences within Canada? And what we learned is more women have been using transit throughout the pandemic, and we use it a bit differently. So we do a lot of trip chaining as an example, where we have multiple stops along the way in our transit journey. So as an example, I might be taking my child to school, and then I hop back on transit to get to work location. Perhaps I stop to pick up groceries, and then I pick up my child at the end of the day, and then make my way to my final destination. So that was one example. Another was, how do we start kind of looking at it a bit differently? Again, that one size fits all, I don't think it's the right paradigm anymore for how we plan our transit service as a whole in all aspects. So another simple example, when we think of safety and security needs, it is a bit different for women, and for those who are non-binary and or transgender, we may not feel comfortable accessing traditional kind of security related infrastructure. So we worked with a lot of community groups, and we heard loud and clear they wanted a discreet way to report any safety concerns while they were in transit. So we added the text messaging service where they could text directly into our control center any concerns they were having. And it's been a phenomenal success. It keeps increasing quarter over quarter, and it's been really popular. And, there's lots of little things we can be doing. When we designed our on-demand service, again, we heard from women the need to consider young children. And do they have to lug car seats with them? Because it's a smaller style van, seating up to 8 people. And that was great feedback. So we went back to the drawing board and said, we got to consider families using this. And what do we need for young children? So that was really important. So I think it's about talking, listening, learning, and adapting to the feedback from our equity seeking groups.
That's a great point. Particularly during the pandemic, as you mentioned, women, racialized people, low-income workers really continued to rely on transit throughout. Are there other comments on this point? Feel free to unmute. Okay. And Jonathan, did you unmute?
No.
Nope. Okay. All right. Okay, so we will carry on with respect to maybe a question for Yona here. So we talked a lot about Canadian examples here. We've got a great panelist provided perspective, but you did work on a recent APTA report with our colleagues to the south discussing best practices for post-pandemic transit planning. So can you tell us a bit about the trend of rebalancing from a hub and spoke model of service to one that supports neighborhood to neighborhood trips? We heard a bit about 10-minute cities earlier, but maybe a bit about what APTA has been discussing.
Absolutely. So in our recent report, we looked at ridership trends and service choices of 5 key agencies across the United States and tried to put those in the context of what's happening overall across the nation. And I would suspect that a lot of the trends are similar to what you're seeing in Canada. And one of the key issues, and it's been brought up several times in this conversation so far, is that this sort of outer neighborhood to downtown commute has been probably the biggest hit part of the transit system. The reliance on getting most of your riders to come downtown in the morning, leave downtown in the evening, was not the case during the pandemic. And it may not be the case into the future, depending on how trends tend to emerge. There are a number of reasons for that. I'm noticing that among the panel here, it looks like several of the people are not at their offices right now. And that's no criticism. That's just a reflection of reality for a huge number of people throughout our society right now. If people are increasingly working from home, they might have different needs during the day. They might have needs that suggest that they need to actually get to other neighborhoods to maybe meet with somebody at a coffee shop, or maybe do other parts of their daily tasks at the middle of the day rather than at the end of the day. In a lot of the ways, this is a positive change. It means that people might be able to have a higher quality of life by taking movements in a way that are not at the peak hour. But it does mean that transit agencies need to think more seriously about whether their services do actually provide those cross neighborhood connections that we need to make those things possible. So Jonathan spoke about the need for a frequent network that extends not just into those routes going downtown, but across the entire region. And I think that that is certainly true. That's something that we heard from all these different transit agencies in the United States. We need to be considering, new routes, higher frequency on existing routes, and potentially integration of different modes, like improved bike connections and things of that sort.
I know that's been something that's been a big point that we've been focusing on here as well. So very transferable stuff. Open to the panel, please.
I guess if I can jump in, yeah, I completely agree with what Jonas said, and that is absolutely where we need to focus. Those are going to be the trips, where there's going to be growth in the future, and where ridership is sustained. And after what Shoshana said, talking about success stories in the 1960s, it brought to mind to me, again, another success story. Toronto was the only city in North America to grow transit ridership from 1945 to 1970. Which is, the heart of the car boom, when we were building highways everywhere. And the key turning point, the decline happened at the same rate as American cities throughout the 50s. The key turning point was when we introduced a suburban bus grid, right across suburban Toronto, so that you could make, both trips to the subway to get downtown, but then also suburb to suburb trips. And it wasn't expected to be a huge success, to be frank, and it actually led to an explosion of ridership. They really took a chance on adding that service, and the ridership really boomed. More recently, we've seen the same thing in Brampton when they've added a frequent grid of transit service, and there's been an explosion in ridership in that city over the last 15 years.
That's an excellent point. Others? Shoshana, I think just unmuted.
Thank you. Yeah, I'd pick up on that. It's interesting that Jonathan said, we did something that was this huge success that we didn't expect to be a success. I think we need to stay open to that idea in the future. For a long time, the future felt really predictable, right? We would make predictions for what ridership was going to be like a year out or 5 years out and feel fairly confident about it. And I really hope that anyone making future predictions has been humbled by the last 2 years. I think between climate change and, who knows what's going on in Europe and changes in our perception of health and safety, the future is more uncertain now than it has been for a very long time. And so our habits of saying, well, we're going to predict the future and then respond to that prediction like the prediction is fixed, needs serious re-examination to think about, okay, we need to have more space for experimentation, more space for trying new things, more space for doing something and then putting the legwork to make it work afterwards, as opposed to all kinds of confidence that whatever we do next, it works with the models and the predictions of the future. We can't predict the future anymore. I mean, we really never could, but right now our crystal balls are very broken and they're unlikely to get fixed. So the only question we can ask is, what do we want to build? What are we hoping the future will look like? And experiment to try to get there as quickly and as effectively as we can.
Okay, thanks very much. Time if there's one more panelist that wants to jump in here.
I can just add a little bit to what Shoshana just shared from an agency perspective. I think trialing things and taking those chances and risks requires really good, I think, collaborative effort with our elected officials or boards and our communities, because, and I'm all for innovation, but sometimes there's a bit of hesitation, I think, and again, based on that older paradigm of, well, that's a lot of investment for something that might not work. But what the pandemic has highlighted, and Kelly touched on it, and I love that she, framed it in this way, it's almost forced us to be more nimble and really push our teams. What can we accomplish? How quickly can we pull it off? And then back to some of the comments a few of us made about measurement. So really, let's have those storytelling opportunities to measure how it went. What were those results? And then learn from it. It might be that we try something and it doesn't work, but that's okay. And what did we learn from it to inform our next steps? So I love that you've highlighted that important kind of concept of, trying things and testing things And you're right, the future is looking differently than maybe the frame of reference we had even 3 years ago. So just wanted to touch on that piece. It was really good.
Thank you very
Sorry,
much.
I would add to that one more time, if you forgive me, that I mean that also for people who say we're never going back to the office. I think anyone who says anything with confidence, right? We're never going to go back to the office. We're all working from home for future, or it's all going back to exactly what it was. I have skepticism on both sides of any strong pronouncement about what the world is going to look like in 6 months or 12 months. I think the pandemic has made fools of all of us on that scale over the last 2 years. I mean, certainly I look forward to going back to my office, but many people do not. And so I think things are just gonna be different. So I love to hear about all the things going on in Edmonton. That sounds really cool.
Yeah, I mean, looking into the future, even by a few weeks, has been difficult at best to do, and certainly the nature of work is which informs and creates a lot of the demand for transit is something we don't yet have a full grasp on. So that's very appreciated as we continue thinking about that as agencies and government folk that are participating in today's call. Turning now, though, to the federal government's most recent announcement on operating support for transit, which was, I touched on that at the beginning. They indicated that support would be conditional on municipalities taking action on housing supply. So there seems to be a broader and growing consensus across the political spectrum that when it comes to connecting transit and affordable housing, it's something that's very important. So thinking about the last election, for example, the Conservatives proposed tying transit infrastructure to minimum density requirements. So I'm going to ask all the panelists here, how can we best foster that connection between transit and affordable housing to deliver more sustainable and inclusive cities? So there's a jump ball, but we'll get to everybody. Yona, you're right on my screen. Why don't you start things off?
Well, this is an intriguing idea, and it's probably a more dramatic intervention than is being proposed in the United States. But I would emphasize that transit works best in areas of higher density, but the choice of higher density is also a choice. In other words, I think Jonathan and Shoshana talked a bit about this, our regions change over time, and the idea that you can predict what the future is going to be in terms of land uses and therefore choose transit investments entirely based on that may be a bit problematic. That said, I do think it's a good idea to be thinking very seriously about whether we are making sure that the areas around future stations, if you're going to make a big investment, actually are going to allow the large increase in housing and other types of uses that really justify that investment. If you only have a limited amount of money to be spending, it should go to areas where you actually have either an existing concentration of people and businesses and other sorts of activities, or where the municipal government has made sure that it has put in the resources, the zoning, and other regulations to make a future where that is possible. Without those types of correspondence between land use decisions and transportation decisions, we could end up with a situation where we have a bunch of transit investments that are going to the wrong places and a bunch of dense areas that are not receiving the transit they need.
Jonathan.
I completely agree. And, I'll say one thing at the outset, I agree with that approach that we need to work on, building development around our stations, and I'll come to that. I think we could also consider transit, tying infrastructure investments to transit service standards, both on the infrastructure itself and on connecting routes, because we're never going to live in a world where all or even the majority of people are within walking distance of a rapid transit station. So we can only maximize the value of that rapid transit if we can get people on a connecting network, it's frequent enough to make transfer reasonable. But in terms of development itself, this is absolutely key. And as Shoshana said, we were a leader in this, and we've gotten to the point where a lot of stations don't have that much development around them in many cases, although that's changing. And sometimes that's a zoning issue, sometimes that's a policy issue, and sometimes it's different kinds of issues. And this is something we really need to address to maximize the value of these investments, to get some money directly back in some cases for transit. and especially focus on employment. You know, a lot of our employment has been dispersed over the last 30 years, and some of it that's not going to change, distribution centers, et cetera. But a lot of our office employment, for example, we really should do our best to focus that on places that are very accessible to transit.
Okay, thank you. Kelly.
I mean, I certainly agree with the sentiments that the other speakers have shared. And I think, I mean, I just think it is, when we're talking about stations and that type of infrastructure, certainly, but I think on the other side of that, we also have to go back to, you know, transit being different going forward. And it's not necessarily, certainly, yes, transit does a great job of carrying a lot of people on those very busy corridors, but you know, affordable housing doesn't necessarily have to be on those busy corridors. It may be in those subdivisions and you know, improving on the on-demand services and you know, the different types of service to help connect those communities into the more frequent transit is also part of what I think municipalities can do going forward. Again, just to make sure that that connectivity is there. You know, there certainly will be municipalities where the opportunity to put that housing isn't necessarily on corridors or places where it would make sense for a transit corridor. But again, transit systems being flexible and looking at alternative ways to serve that community well and get it connected with the higher frequencies, I think would also work in our favor.
Okay, thanks a lot. Carrie?
I think a lot has been well said. I would just add, you know, issues of land use, housing, and transportation are so intertwined. And it's a bit of chicken and egg, which comes first, second, third. I'm fully supportive of looking at this in an integrated way. I think when we think about and that concept of just enabling a better life for people living in our cities and in our communities, we need all of these elements really cohesively working together. And it always makes me sad when I see that disjointed, and someone referenced, you know, these transit investments, but it's not in an area that's generating a lot of development. And, you know, I think we have to bring transit to people and also people to transit. So encouraging more development. We have a very aggressive city plan for Edmonton, anticipating doubling our population in the long term, and strategically looking at development within our existing boundaries. So lots of discussions about transit-oriented development, lots of talk about, you know, zoning, land use. How do we encourage that development with transit, integrating transit within that urban form? So that's definitely something that we're working on and very active. And I would just end by saying, you know, housing issues, I think, are affecting all of us, larger urban centers, in a more profound way because of the pandemic. So it's disproportionately impacting those that don't have housing, and we're seeing it affect not just, you know, transit, but all of our public spaces. So the priority around housing solutions, I think, is even more important as a result of the impact of the pandemic.
Okay, and let's close this round of housing with a comment from Shoshana.
Thank you. I agree with most of everything that has been said before. So it's a bit of a challenge to go last. So I will loop back to your original question, which is the federal government has offered transport funding with the caveat that you have to plan it with land use and whether or not we think that's a good idea. For me, that's a really easy one. There's absolutely no way we should ever make a transit investment that isn't land use coordinated. And so good on the federal government for making that explicit and tying their very hefty carrot together with reasonable minimum long-term standards. So yes, I totally agree with it. Then there's a question of how do we do that well? There were some comments that, you know, we shouldn't only build affordable housing along a high capacity corridors, and that's true. It seems unreasonable to expect that housing is only built in places where the air quality is worse. But if we talk about what walking distance is to a transit station, we usually say it's about 10 to 15 minutes or about half a mile. So a kilometer, 800 meters. If you draw that route around most stations, you get quite far from main corridors in Toronto, for instance, what we call stable neighborhoods, 2.5-story single family homes, sometimes semi-detached, but often detached. And within 800 meters of stations where no development is currently allowed. And so we don't have to just be talking about the corridors. We could be talking within walking distance of stations with all different kinds of land use. And it doesn't have to be one tall tower. It could be lots of 4-story fourplexes or a sixplex or a low-rise multiplex. There's lots and lots of ways to put more housing into neighborhoods that don't follow a current sort of standard form where we build one really strong big tower around a station. So going back into the history books again a little bit, because I love the old literature. You know, we're talking about these things now, and there's so much we could draw on of what people have been telling us for the last 100 years. There's a report in the early 70s by Knight and Treg about how to build a successful transit system and how to build it successfully with land use. And say you need a couple things. One, you need development pressure, and we have that in abundance in Canadian communities at the moment. Toronto will probably grow by 1 million people within the next 10, 15 years, which is, you know, unimaginable. They all have to live somewhere. They all have to move somewhere. Lots of other cities are facing that. So we have development pressure in spades. Then you need to build the infrastructure, and then you need supportive policy to make it all work together. And this is something that we have often been resistant to doing because it's not politically easy. And hopefully with some pressure from the federal government and some local gumption, we can do that better in the future.
Agreed on that. Thank you. Thank you. And keeping with the theme of interventions by the federal government, other levels of government, let's turn our attention to the consequences, kind of picking up on Shoshana's last point. If we don't continue to build transit, if we don't continue to keep transit running. So in particular, we have that announcement from last week. So let's take a minute here and talk about consequences if provinces don't take the Prime Minister up on his offer and don't match and deliver those critical operating funds. So for this round, let me start with Kelly. I know she's done great work on the ongoing operating issue through her leadership at Opta, and then I'll open the floor. Kelly, over to you.
Sure. I think probably to sum it up in a nutshell, if we don't see provinces step up and take this offer, all of the things that we've just talked about for the last hour are in jeopardy. You know, we're all talking about what we need to do to try to regain ridership, to keep things going. And quite honestly, I think if provinces don't step up, we're going to see major service level reductions because municipalities do not have it, you know, within their budgets to be able to fill that gap that we're seeing right now from, you know, from the losses of revenue associated with our declines in ridership. But I just want to add the caveat to that I do think everybody has a role to play. I don't think this is just a handout to help transit systems continue doing what they've been doing. I mean, we've talked about that, you know, the pandemic made fools of us, and I certainly agree. I think it's called into question any number of things, but we certainly do all have a role to play, and it's great. I mean, I hear Carrie, I talk to, you know, many other transit systems, and it's great to hear us all talking about going forward, doing things differently, adapting, looking for different ways to deliver. But at the end of the day, I can't remember who said it, but one of the speakers said, at the end of the day, in order for us to be successful, transit has to be accessible to everyone. And the last thing we need right now is either significant service cuts or fare increases in order to try to make up that revenue. That has the very strong potential of putting us back into one of those downward spirals that I was fortunate enough to be in the transit industry back in the 90s when the last one happened. And it, you know, that's something that will certainly has the potential to set us back for another decade in terms of getting ridership back to where it needs to be. So that's on the operating side. The only other piece I would add is it also has the potential to have impacts on capital investment. You know, certainly almost every transit system, I think, in the country is looking at zero emission fleets, looking at those transitions. That comes with a huge price tag. But I think focus will be lost on that if transit systems are struggling to even keep the operating dollars in place to keep the system that they've got operating. So I think there's a number of things on the table, and I you know, certainly it would be very unfortunate if we see systems have to, you know, start making those tough decisions.
Absolutely, and in the that and the impact of this operating funding is felt most tremendously as well in the Greater Toronto area. So maybe I'll take a comment from Jonathan next on the risks of not being able to operate the systems of today as effectively as we can.
Yeah, I mean, to follow up on what was said before, we can't fall into the same trap that we did in the early 90s, which, took a decade or more to recover from, and really we never recovered the trend. And this would really be a tragedy, when we're talking about climate change, when we're talking about our fast growing cities, when we're talking about our housing prices. The last thing we need to see is, because of this, external force, a slashing of transit service. And when you look at capital spending, right, every major Canadian city has huge capital investments underway right now, and that is a great thing, and these projects are much needed. But what a terrible waste of money it would be if we spent all this money on these great capital projects only to have them open into a decimated transit system, because we didn't bridge that gap as we wait for riders to return. So keeping the transit systems intact through this trough, hopefully we'll recover most of the ridership, and get some new riders in other places. That's absolutely critical to keeping our cities moving, powering our recovery, and then also maximizing the value of these capital investments.
Indeed, it does, and it makes us reflect on some of the statistics that we would use going forward to help to measure success of transit systems after we are past this critical point of needing operational support. Let me turn things over to Johan.
I think I heard you, but there was a bit of a sound issue there. I would reaffirm everything that Jonathan has pointed to here. I think we have an opportunity to think really positively about the future of our transit systems in our cities, and I hope that we're able to leverage these federal programs in both Canada and the United States to produce those transit systems that are both operationally reliable, frequent, and are up to par in terms of their capital provisions. So I think that there's a big opportunity here. I'm looking forward to the future in these investments.
Okay, you did hear me right. I've been advised somehow I'm quiet, so I'm going to project a little bit, so excuse me. We'll go to Shoshana and then Carrie.
I agree with everybody that we should step in to fill the operating gaps so that we maintain our service and don't send our systems into the feared death spiral, because it's cutting off our nose to spite our face. It's so much to the disadvantage of our future, both near term and long term. But we should also have on the table municipalities paying for it if they need to. If the provincial governments won't step up, if the federal governments won't step up, we should pay for it ourselves. My local politicians keep saying things like, it's going to cost $300 per family, or we'd have to cut service. I'm like, okay, here's my $300. And I recognize that I'm in a very privileged position. I have a good job at the university. I didn't lose my job over the pandemic, but there's a huge amount of private wealth in Toronto and a huge number of people whose wealth went up over the pandemic rather than down. And our municipal government should be willing, if they need to put taxes in place to pay for our services. If we want to be big kids at the constitutional table, we should behave accordingly.
Well put. And we'll close this discussion on the need for operational funding and its consequences. And I know Edmonton, has been working through a substantial deficit, but maintaining service. So Carrie, to close this round, I think it'd be great here with a comment.
Thanks so much. I think if you were to ask me what keeps me up at night, this is it. And it's been this way for the entire time throughout the pandemic. There's a few layers that I'll highlight. One, there's a responsibility, I think, for Kelly and I and our colleagues to be doing everything we can to get people back. So lots of, promotions and marketing and activations and encouragement to get people back. I think we have to be as efficient as we can with our expenditures, and I've been doing that. I have cut expenses as much as I can to try and offset some of these pressures. But ultimately, municipalities can't run deficits, at least not in Alberta. And, passing on a tax burden to people, during a time where a lot of people have experienced hardship and difficulties, I think that's a really risky move. And I don't think it would get a lot of support around the elected officials' tables. And I don't think Edmontonians would support it. I think there is an appetite, to have conversations about cost recovery and expectations, but I just don't think we're there yet in terms of passing on big tax increases during this time. Bigger picture, I'm very worried if we do not get some type of support, and again, all of us working together, what does it do to our economy and our economic recovery as a city and as a province? Transit plays a really, really important role in getting people to jobs and fostering employment through some of the capital elements that Kelly highlighted. Lots of LRT expansion for us and other projects. And I think it could shake some of that confidence in our recovery. So this is definitely what keeps me up at night. And, I was excited to see the announcement last week, but there's so much more work to do to see how we make this work for us.
Okay, thank you. Appreciate that. There certainly is quite a lot of work to do, but also important to look at also the successes that we've had in advocating over the last few years. And it's thanks to the folks on our panel, the folks in our audience, our members across the country, our stakeholders. We could not have weathered these 2 years without everybody rowing in the same direction, really delivering for Canadians during this last 24 months. That's it's really, I think, been a great thing. So with that, let me thank our panel for their views and their thoughts, and we look forward to working on all the issues that we touched on, which have yet to be resolved. We will keep doing that. So thank you to each of you for your time. We do have a French public policy forum that's starting at 2:15 Eastern, so in about 18 minutes from now. You can continue this discussion on our Twitter account at Canadian Transit. So feel free to post there. We'll be posting some clips here and really appreciate that. And finally, of course, we have our Quebec City Spring Summit and AGM coming up April 3, 4, and 5. And registration's open for that. We have an excellent program. So we will leave it there for today. Thank you again to the panel, and thanks to all of you for registering. Have a great rest of your day. Bye-bye. Thank you.